Hello, we're here today to show you the various steps of our metal fabrication unit. The first step is developing an idea on paper. If you're developing a ring of some sort, something that needs to be sized specifically, the first step is figuring out the size for your finger. So depending on what finger you intend on wearing the ring on, the most simple step to do this is simply take a small strip of paper and you're going to wrap the piece of paper around the knuckle area of the finger you intend to wear it on. The reason we do it on the knuckle area is because typically the knuckle area is going to be the thickest part of your finger. Now we want to do it in an offsetting way so we can see the underlying piece of paper along with the top piece. We will make a small line with a pencil or pen on the top piece of paper. When we open this up, we will see the length of the piece of metal we need for our metal project. Okay, once we get the length of our metal piece that we need for our ring, the next step is to kind of develop our first idea here, which is going to be simply a plain band with a round piece of metal up on the top, typically kind of where a jewel might be. So this is a 3D look at what the ring design is, the concept. This picture here is kind of an idea of looking at it in an aerial way, which helps us figure out how we're going to cut these pieces out of flat pieces of metal. So we have the bottom piece here with the top rounded piece that we talked about. Now down here we have what we've developed, we call them templates. So these are specifically to size and shape, and being that we have two parts to our ring, we need two templates. So using the piece of paper that we used to measure our finger earlier, we know the length that we need, so that's indicated by these two lines here. From that point we need to indicate, then draw out to size and shape what the shape of the ring band is that we want, but then also how wide we want it to be. So that's indicated here. We want a plain band, so we used a ruler to basically draw out straight lines and figure out the width that we have here. The other template is right here, which is the round piece. So now we're going to cut these two pieces out and we'll use the. There we go. All right. So this first tool here is a small anvil. We can use this for flattening and dimpling pieces of metal. This next tool is a hole punch. The main method that this is used for is to actually punch specifically sized circles out of metal. It's much easier than cutting them out with a saw. This next tool here is used for doming circles of metal, so we can create concave or convex pieces of metal that can add depth and 3D qualities to your metal projects. So this first demonstration, we're going to show a couple different things we can do with the small anvil, and we have two hammers we're going to use for this demonstration. The first one is a ball peen hammer with a small rounded tip, and the second hammer is a rawhide hammer or a soft hammer. The rawhide hammer can be used to shape metal, but because it's made out of rawhide and it's soft, it will not dent the metal. The ball peen hammer we can use to actually dimple or create a ripple effect on the surface of the metal. So first we'll start with the soft hammer, and we have a rounded piece of metal. Sometimes you may have situations where your metal bends in the wrong direction. What we can simply do is use the flat surface on the anvil along with the soft hammer to slowly pound and re-flatten areas of the metal. So the next thing we can do with the ball peen hammer and that small anvil is we can dimple the surface of metal, so it'll create a rippled effect to it. So using the smaller rounded tip of the ball peen hammer, we can go over the surface so that it creates a rippled or dimpled effect to the surface. Alright, the next tool we're going to demonstrate is the hole punch. Now we can use this to punch out different sized circles in our metal for a perfect circle shape. So the first thing we're going to do is we're on this hard surface table which prevents any bouncing. We're also going to keep these pieces on this rubber base here so that it prevents any bouncing as well. Now this central piece here twists and it will open up the two pieces of the tool. We can slip our metal inside of that area. Once we do that and it's aligned, we will slowly tighten this down, trapping the metal inside. Next, we'll find the appropriate piece that fits inside the hole, and the tip should be slightly sharpened and kind of tilted to one side. This is the top part that's actually going to go down head first into the hole. This area is the back side we'll be pounding on. So we'll insert that. The hammer we use for this is the brass hammer. It's extremely heavy and it gives enough force so that we can drive this through the metal. When you're doing this, you want to brace your hand on top of the tool and then slowly pound on top. Once this drops through, you can lift this up and then you'll have your circle punched out. The next tool we have here is the doming tool. So you can see various tips of various sizes, and then we have the second piece here that we're actually doming the metal inside of. So the idea is you're going to take a circle which you've punched out and we can place it inside one of these areas, find the appropriate sized piece to go along with it. We will place that on top and then simply using the heavy brass hammer, pound. What this is going to do is force the metal into that shape. So now we have a domed, rounded piece of metal that we can add to our design. Alright, next we're going to demonstrate how to saw out your various templates for your metal project. Alright, next we're going to demonstrate how to saw out your various templates for your metal project. Some of the tools we'll be using for this include the saw frame. We have this wooden block which we use as an extension off the table, and the C-clamp is to actually connect this to the table. So that's one thing we can start with, is connecting the wooden piece with the C-clamp off the edge of your table. What this is going to do is provide a nice space, nice open space that we can saw our various templates out of this area. Before we start cutting with the saw on our metal, what we need to first do is set up the blade inside the frame. Now, when you grab the blade, they're extremely small and they're flexible. One thing to note is they will break, so we have some tips that we need to think about when we're setting this up in the frame. The first thing we need to do is make sure that the teeth or the sawing pieces of the blade are headed in the right direction so that we're sawing correctly. So one tip we can do is to take this and hold it up to the light so that we can see that the teeth are pointing in a down direction. Alright? Now, when setting up in the frame, the first thing we're going to do is loosen the bottom part of the frame, allowing these two pieces to come apart. We'll slip the blade into that area and tighten this down. Now, the frames are adjustable, so what we need to do is make sure that this length of the blade is at a position where it's just touching the tip of the blade. When we get to that point, we'll tighten this bottom piece down, and to finish it off or close off the top part, we'll loosen this top piece, place the blade inside there, and to make sure that it's tight, we're actually going to pinch the frame against the table. While we hold that position, we will tighten this top piece down. Once we've got the blade set up in a down and out position, the next step is to start beginning to cut out our metal pieces. Now you can see here we have our paper template, which is using just a simple glue stick. We've glued this down onto our metal piece. The next step is to start sawing this out. So using this wooden extended piece which we've attached to the table, we're going to position our blade at an angle to get started in the metal. Now we want to start with an angle, and you're going to start slow. Sometimes the blade will jump around on you. Once we get going in the metal, we're actually going to start to bring the blade in a more vertical or up and down position. The key is to use as much of the length of the blade. As you can see, I'm trying to show going up and down, using the entire length, not small strokes. So using the entire length, we're now just going to follow the edge of our design. Now, depending on your design, you may have some areas where you need to make curves or sharp right angles. In this case, the blade can withstand that, but the big key is to actually continue to move the blade up and down as we're turning from one direction to the other. So I'm going to demonstrate that as I come up to a corner of my design. I'm going to slowly start to turn my blade, but I'm continuing to move it up and down as I'm turning the blade. Once I get that turn, now I continue to saw in the opposite direction. Before we get started on the next step, we'd like to take a little more time basically to show you a few more tools. This tool, which we'll use in a second, is the acetylene torch in my left hand. In my right hand is a striker. So we can use the striker to start the torch when we need to use it. Moving down here, we've got two tools that we actually use in the soldering process. The first one here is a stand that we can use to solder flat pieces together in the case of perhaps a keychain or a pendant of some sort. The clamp here, which we open by pressing this area right here, this can be used for holding different pieces of metal, and it works especially well for making rings. Down here we've got some other tools. We have tweezers, which we can use to pick up metal pieces, especially when they're hot. We've got two picks, which we can use. They're heat resistant on the handle, so we can push pieces around while we have the flame on them. We have a pair of needle nose pliers, which we can use to bend or shape the metal. We've got our soft hammer again, and this is called a ring mandrel, which we can use to not only size the rings, we've got the ring sizes here, but we can also use it to basically shape our rings into a round shape. Next, we're going to show how to bend your piece of metal using the ring mandrel into that round shape to prepare it to solder the two ends together. So what we can do, just holding on to the ring mandrel and using your metal, the metal when it's this thin, we typically can start the bending process just using our thumbs. So what we can do is place the metal on that surface and then slowly start to bend the metal around the ring mandrel. Now once we've used the ring mandrel to shape the bottom part of our ring, you'll notice we have two open pieces. The two open pieces of the metal are pointing up. The key right now is not so much to get a round shape, but now we need to get these end pieces facing each other totally so that we're ready to solder. So using the needle nose pliers, we're going to slowly start to bend these pieces down flat. The key is to get them completely together and flat, like this, and then so that they're completely flush with no light shining through. Once we get the ring set up so that we have the top pieces together, the next step is to connect them using the soldering process. So for rings, we're going to use this clamp that we talked about earlier. So pressing these two ends together, we're going to open it up so that the ring actually goes inside these two pieces, with the seam side facing up. So we want to try to position it so that it's nice and flat. We can also turn this part of the base of the stand so that we get this nice and flat, basically parallel to the ground or to the counter here. Next, using one of these picks, we're going to use what's called flux. Okay, this flux we're going to put a small amount using the pick onto the seam. So next I'll hold the piece of metal and slowly I want to spread this out on the seam area. What this is going to do is a couple things. Clean the metal a little bit as the soldering process is happening, but then also help the solder to melt. Once I have that, next I can take a small little square of solder using the pick, or we can use tweezers, which we have down here. We're going to place that piece of solder right on the seam, just like that. Once we have our metal piece set up for soldering with the flux and the solder, The next step is to basically get the torch set up. So what we're going to demo quick here is just actually lighting the torch. The first thing I need to do is have safety glasses on. So we're going to put those on. Safety first. The next step is we're going to turn on the torch. Okay. Now down here we have different valves and things like that. The teachers will always have these set up. The only thing you need to be concerned about is actually turning the gas on with this valve. So turning this valve towards you will slowly turn the torch on. Now you should be able to slightly hear it. If it's extremely loud like this, it means it's going to produce a bigger flame, so we want it nice and low. The next step is using the striker. We're going to strike right in front of the tip of the torch. Now from here we can turn the torch up or down using this valve. The key is to have a nice blue flame, but you don't want to hear the flame. Something like this would be too high. So slowly turning the valve away from you in this direction will turn down the torch. Now that we've demoed how to light the torch, the next step is to light the torch and actually solder these two ends of the ring together. So once again, with my safety glasses on, first I'm going to turn the valve towards myself slightly so I can hear the gas. Next I'm going to strike the striker in front of the tip of the torch. So I'll turn this up just a little bit. The next step is to have the torch in one hand, and I'll have one of these heat resistant picks in the other hand. So I can use the torch to heat the area with the solder, but I can use the pick to basically move any pieces around or to hold the piece of solder onto that area. So the first thing I'm going to do is position the flame pointing up on the underside right here of the seam. So without getting too close, I'm first going to just slowly heat the underside of the seam. You'll start to notice some bubbling on the solder. What I can do now is I can come up on top as well. What I'm looking for is the flux to burn off. The flux typically will burn off at the same time when the solder begins to melt. So now the solder is starting to slowly melt. Once it melts completely, I'm going to take the pick and slowly run it along the seam to make sure that it fills that entire seam area. One last quick demo with the soldering process is some of you may have pieces of metal in your design that are flat if you're doing a keychain or perhaps a pendant or something like that. So instead of using the other stand, we're using something that's more of a flat stand with this metal grate. So what I've got is I've got two pieces of metal here pre-set up with solder and with the flux. So I put that on the bottom piece. The next step is to position your top piece in the direction that you want it. And using the torch now, I can slowly start to heat up these two pieces of metal. Now because it's a little different than the ring, I can't see the solder melt. So what I'm looking for is this gap that's in between the two pieces of metal to start to move around. And as I'm starting to wait for the solder to melt, it will, when it does completely melt, it'll peek out the sides here and we'll start to see a silver area, which you can kind of see in this direction right here. Also, you'll notice that the metal's getting a little orange. Sometimes to be completely safe, it's best to just heat the metal up until it's nice and hot, which will ensure that the solder has melted completely. Now once we solder our pieces together, whether it's a ring or two flat pieces, the next step is to quench the metal in water. So using tweezers, we're going to pick up the pieces of metal, place it completely in water, just for a couple seconds. After that point, we can pull it back out. It will be cool enough to touch, and we want to just test the metal pieces by pulling on them to make sure that they're completely connected. Now, In the case of rings, once we have our ring completely soldered, the seam area, the next step is to complete the rounding process. So using the ring mandrel, we're going to slide this down as far as we can onto the ring mandrel. Using the soft hammer, we're going to slowly pound around the edges and slide this down until we get a nice round shape. Now I'm also going to flip this around in the opposite direction and do the same thing. Once we're done with the soft hammer, pounding the shape, we can pull this back out and just check for the nice round shape that we're looking for. Now once we have our ring rounded out and the seams are soldered, the next step is, if you have a piece you're adding onto your band, this would be the next step where you can solder that piece on. Now, using the hole punch earlier, we punched out a nice perfect circle that we're going to put on top of our ring band. Now to solder it works the same way as we demonstrated earlier. What you're going to do is first start with the flux, putting a small piece of flux in the area you intend to attach this to. From that point next, you'll take tweezers or one of your picks, and you're going to pick up a small piece of solder. Then you'll simply take your next piece and sandwich those two pieces together. It's a little more difficult with a round ring, and so you have to be careful so that you're balancing it, keeping things nice and even. From this point I can start the torch up. Now using the pick, I'm going to make sure I can balance this metal piece on top of the other. So as we're soldering this, we're going to start on the inside, pointed up, kind of in this direction underneath the two pieces. I'm going to be careful so that I don't knock that top piece off. So I'm using the pick in this other hand to slowly hold it in place if it starts to move on me. And it is doing that a little bit now. Now from this point I can hold the top piece down, and I'm just kind of waiting for the solder to melt. So once that piece kind of falls, you'll notice it kind of fall and attach itself, and you may also see some solder show up on the sides. What I can do is turn off the torch, and then from that point we're going to quench it like we did before. So kind of carefully testing this area to see if it's hot. I can pinch this using tweezers, release this, and then quench your ring in the water. And then we just test to make sure that the pieces are attached. Now once we have the various parts of our rings, our ring or our metal project put together, soldered together, the next step is to start the cleaning process so that we get a nice polished shine. You will notice once you get things put together with the torch and through the soldering process that everything gets slightly discolored, and that's just from the torch itself. It will dirty the surface and just create areas that seem to be discolored and dirty. So the first step from this point on is to place your design into what we call pickle solution. What this is basically a chemical bath that helps to clean the surface a little bit before we do anything else. So turning this on low, then what we can do is simply drop this. Alright, so now we've just gotten done soldering our metal pieces together. We have put our metal, first we've quenched it in the water to cool it off, and then we've put it in the pickle solution to clean it up. So now we're going to use the copper tongs and get our ring out of the pickle solution. Alright, so it's cleaned up a little bit more. Not all of the tarnish is completely off. So what we're going to do now is take it over to the sink to rinse off with water to get that the pickle chemicals that cleans it up, to get that off of there. and then we'll demonstrate how to file and sand the surface. Don't actually pause now or stop. Alright, so now we'll rinse this off under the sink. And then next we'll come over here and we have some different types of sandpaper. We have more of a grittier sandpaper that will take off kind of the top surface of the tarnish that we have here. And then we also have a finer grit which we can use actually with water. It's called wet dry sandpaper. So you can actually use this with water too to actually help clean off some of this tarnish that's on the surface of the ring as well. Okay, so now we're going to demonstrate how to clean the surface first with the file. In this drawer we have different large files and small files. The smaller files have different shapes depending on what you're trying to do. This one has a flat surface on one side and kind of a pointed or a triangular surface on this side. So you'd want to pick one that basically would help you with the surface you're trying to work with. We've got just a flat file here. We're going to use it over the surface to basically get rid of the really big, the really large tarnished areas, and also to eliminate this excess solder that we have on here. So basically you're just going to take the file and rub it across the surface, and the key is also to be pressing down as you're going across the surface. If you're just lightly going across the surface, it's not really going to do anything. You have to apply pressure too. So as we go over the surface, you can see the tarnish is coming off, and then the shininess of the underlayer is basically showing up. Okay? So what you'd like to do is go over the entire surface, inside, outside of the ring, the sides of the ring, to basically clean off this top layer of tarnish using some sort of a file. And it should be basically filed down to a point where you see that shine. One thing too to note about the seam that you're working with on your ring, you should be able to file this to a point where almost you don't see the seam at all. So this is kind of a tedious process, but in the end it'll make the ring look a lot nicer. So we'll go just a little bit longer here, clean up this area. Alright, so now that we've filed the surface here, the next step is to use the two different types of sandpaper that we've picked up before. This is the more coarse sandpaper. You'd want to use this first, and then use the wet dry second. So basically what we're going to do is just kind of fold this in half, and you're going to go over the entire surface using this sandpaper as well. And what this is going to do is continue to clean the surface of the metal, slightly shine it up. It will also kind of start to take out some of the larger scrapes that were left on the metal from the file. And now we'll take the wet dry, and this is kind of an in-between sandpaper as far as polishing and cleaning. Alright, so now I'm just going to demo using the wet dry sandpaper again, but using it with some running water, and this will actually aid in the cleanup process even more. So we've got the ring slightly wet, and we've also got the sandpaper slightly wet, and what that's going to do is not only clean it but slightly shine it up. You can see here it's starting to get nice and shiny now. So next we're going to demonstrate the actual polishing process. We've got everything sanded up here. We've filed the surface to clean it. We've used the coarse sandpaper, and then we've used the finer wet dry sandpaper. In these drawers down here we've got some Dremel tools. In here the Dremel tools are labeled as far as what they do. This one's a polishing Dremel tool, which will help clean this up. So it's got a different tip. It's a soft tip on here, not a grinding tip, but a soft felt tip that we'll use with the polish. We also need a clamp to hold the ring. So the clamps and the wedges are down here. So what we're going to do is take the ring and set it up inside this clamp. because as we use the Dremel tool, the ring will get hot from the friction. So we set up the clamp, or the ring inside the clamp there, and then we try to push the wedge inside here as much as we can. And basically what that's going to do is clamp this down nice and tight so that the ring doesn't go anywhere, and then we'll actually hold on to the clamp while we work on polishing the ring. So next what we can do is set this down. We've got the Dremel tool. How this works is basically you just slide this lever in this direction. The more you slide over the button, it's basically going to speed up the spinning of the Dremel tool. In this bin we've got the polish that we're going to use. So the polish is basically just one large chunk, and what we're going to do is actually turn on the Dremel tool nice and low and just dig the tip of that into the polish a little bit so that we're coating the surface. And then what we can do is turn this up a little bit higher, and then we'll go over the surface. Now, similar to the filing, you want to apply a little bit of pressure so that you're really starting to dig down into the surface and start to shine it up. It may leave a little residue. You can see here we're starting to see the shine of the ring from the polish, but then we also have a little bit of residue here. This will just clean off with soap and water. So basically you're going to use the Dremel tool like this over the entire surface to get it as shiny as you'd like it to be. Next we'll demonstrate how to just clean it up with some soap and water. Okay, so now we've polished the entire surface. You can see it's nice and shiny. We don't have any spots that we really missed. If you tend to see some spots that maybe aren't as shiny as you'd like, you can always go back over it with more polish. When you're all done, you'll just rinse this off with soap and water, and then you're finished.